In just a fortnight, Ukraine will complete 1 year since the Russian invasion began. And in a first, the Ukrainian president visited Britain and Paris. During the meet with the world leaders, the Ukrainian president again reiterated his Wings for Freedom plea, urging the West to supply Ukraine with fighter jets. And in a glimmer of hope for Zelensky and his country, UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has said that nothing is off the table. To understand Zelensky's tour of Europe and whether the fighter jets will prove to be the magic wand in the ongoing war, we have with us Adam Schwartz, who is a writer and a political commentator from London. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Schwartz.
Good to be with you.
Now, UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has made a very strong statement. He says that nothing is off the table when it comes to provide military assistance to Ukraine. How do you assess Sunak's latest statement, and do you think Ukraine will receive fighter jets anytime soon?
Well, I think it's a very significant comment and a very diplomatically and politically significant trip for Zelensky, of course. And I think it really contrasts with some of the other statements that we've seen from NATO leaders, such as German Chancellor Scholz, who essentially not only a week ago just ruled out the provision of fighter jets to Ukraine. And I really think it does indicate the way things are going in terms of how NATO is looking towards its support for Ukraine. And we already know that the UK is going to provide training to Ukrainian fighter pilots in the UK. And I think really that will provide the kind of first step towards ultimately providing modern fighter jets. We're not exactly sure, what type of fighter jets they will be yet. Currently, previously we've heard calls for F-16 fighter jets to be provided to Ukraine. It's not something that the UK has in its armament, but however, the UK does have the ability to train fighter jets on a whole range of different modern sort of simulator equipment, which means that actually Ukrainian pilots would be able to use all kinds of different fighter jets. And I think really the symbolism of the whole trip really indicates actually that Ukraine is quite likely to receive fighter jets, possibly in the medium or long term. Firstly, the fact that Zelensky's call when he was addressing the British Parliament yesterday for fighter jets was received with rapturous applause, shows that there is legislative support for UK to provide fighter jets to Ukraine, but also the fact that Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was pictured with President Zelensky wearing fighter jet helmets when they were visiting some of the facilities that Ukrainian pilots will be trained on yesterday, really is a kind of further sort of symbolism and indication that really is something that UK is willing to do. I think that may have a very important impact upon the rest of Europe. As we know, as we saw a few weeks ago with the decision over tanks, the UK has sort of provided quite an important sort of instigator role in terms of trying to push the boundaries of what NATO countries are willing to provide to Ukraine. And as we initially saw, the UK announced it would provide 12 Challenger tanks to Ukraine. That was immediately followed by other NATO countries promising to provide other modern tanks as well. So I think it's following a very similar pattern to what we saw with the tanks.
Also tell us more in terms of how providing Ukraine with fighter jets will change the course of the ongoing war.
Well, I think it's really important to look at it in the context of, other weapons that Ukraine has received. We saw just over about 6-7 weeks ago, Ukraine being provided with Patriot missile defenses. We saw, as I mentioned a few weeks ago, Ukraine being promised with modern tanks. So I think, if Ukraine was to receive modern fighter jets, that would really be sort of one of the final components that Ukraine needs to really bring its military up to modern standard. And I think, it's very difficult to fight a war if you don't have, let's say, air supremacy, or at least the ability to compete in the airspace. And at the moment, we've really seen for the past year, Russia really able to dominate the skies, not only with its fighter jets, but also with ballistic and cruise missiles. So the fact that Ukraine will have, or potentially would have, an additional layer of defense would be hugely significant in terms of both its defensive and offensive capabilities. Would mean that it'd be much easier for Ukraine to shoot down cruise missiles, which is currently very difficult to do on its MiG fighter jets. It would be much easier to provide air support to its ground forces, but also crucially, it could provide medium and long range attack capabilities for Ukraine, which of course it would enable some of those sites deep within the east of Ukraine, or even in Russia itself, to be struck. So I think, really in a whole range of different offensive and defensive capabilities, this would really, support Ukraine in its attempts to push Russia back to where the borders of Ukraine are.
Right now, the fighter jets will certainly give Ukraine an edge in the ongoing war, and Russia has clearly warned London against sending these fighter jets to Ukraine. But I want to ask you that what kind of political and military ramifications is Russia hinting at here?
Well, Russia really is trying to employ this leverage over the West, really every possible stage of the West's support for Ukraine. And of course, that is related to a whole range of different things. It has threatened very thinly veiled nuclear threats towards the West, which I don't think anyone really takes too seriously. But it's also to try to, of course, harness its natural resources, its dependency that the West continues to have over Russian oil and gas. So, I think generally the way that Russia tries to do this is through sort of ambiguity. It doesn't often say exactly what it would do to the West, but it tries to hint through trying to, increase the West's view of what escalation might look like. And as we know from statements really for the past 12 months, the West's priority is that actually this doesn't turn into a sort of NATO-Russia confrontation, but it maintains a Ukraine-Russia confrontation. So I think really, that's the biggest thing that the West fears. But I think ultimately, if the West is providing or willing to provide much modern equipment to Ukraine, it won't do on the basis that it does seriously think that there would be a chance that Russia would or act in a military way against the West. So I think, we could still see, further consequences in terms of Russia trying to shut, oil and gas from the West. But I don't think this specifically, at least the decision specifically, would lead to military confrontation. But it's possible that the military consequences of Ukraine receiving fighter jets would lead to some kind of escalation in events. But I say I don't believe the decision in its own right would actually cause some kind of Russian military back against the West.
Right, Mr. Schwartz. Now, in the past as well, West has sent really mixed signals towards Ukraine in supplying fighter jets. US and Germany have already rejected these claims. Now, do you think UK is Ukraine's most dependable ally, considering that Rishi Sunak has clearly said that nothing is off the table?
Well, I would say, in terms of dependability, really it's the US that's provided the vast majority of military aid to Ukraine. It's provided, more than the rest of NATO countries put together. So certainly from that perspective, I would say that the US is one of the most important allies. However, I think the UK has a very specific role that other European countries may not necessarily be playing, and that is to instigate, certain discussions within the rest of NATO about what exactly it wants to provide to Ukraine. And we saw even before the war began, the UK was one of the first countries to provide very advanced anti-tank and anti-ship missiles to Ukraine. I think really, that has kind of positioned the UK as a kind of unique partner to Ukraine in the sense that it kind of pushes the boundaries of what NATO may be considering at the time, which has really been so important for Ukraine's diplomatic push that it's really had over the last 12 months for more weapons, because we saw at the beginning of the war, the huge concerns about this rapidly escalating between the West and Russia, but basically through very skilled diplomacy on Ukraine's side, actually we've seen the amount of weapons and the type of weapons that Ukraine received really slowly ratcheted up, and I think that's been quite a good strategy for Ukraine, and also to kind of arm itself in a way that may not necessarily provoke Russia in a way that perhaps providing all these kind of equipment up front would have done.
Right, Mr. Schwartz, also tell us about the political significance of this visit, keeping in mind that this is just the second visit of the Ukrainian president abroad since the Russian invasion of Ukraine began.
Well, I think it's very significant in kind of diplomatic and political and military reasons for both Ukraine and the UK. I think at the moment it's the UK and Germany that have been the biggest supporters of Ukraine in terms of providing military aid, and I think the fact that Zelensky decided to visit the UK rather than Germany first is quite important in terms of understanding how Zelensky wants to frame relations really with the West of Europe. And I think that, let's say, as I mentioned, Germany has received quite a lot of criticism from Ukraine and others for not kind of providing what it should be doing in terms of what it could be doing. So I think the fact that, Zelensky chose the UK really shows a degree of warmth that they have for the UK. But I think, as I mentioned, I think there was so much symbolism yesterday in terms of the support for Zelensky. And really, there isn't much sort of opposition, certainly mainstream opposition within UK politics here towards providing support for Ukraine. Really, throughout Zelensky's whole speech to Parliament yesterday, we saw, broad bipartisan support from both the Conservatives and the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats, but also from the Scottish National Party, really in throughout Zelensky's whole speech. And so I think that shows sort of a degree of political unity within the UK that perhaps doesn't quite exist in some other European countries. And I think, the fact that, Zelensky visited the UK, really sort of solidifies that. But, of course, Zelensky will be fully aware that, the countries that he visits really provide a sort of political boost to the incumbent leaders. Of course, Biden received a boost when he received Zelensky. I think Sunak will receive a little boost, from receiving Zelensky itself. So I think ultimately it does solidify what we know to be a very sort of unique relationship between the UK and Ukraine.
Right, Mr. Schwartz, my last question to you before I let you go. The question on everyone's mind, when will the war in Ukraine end?
I think it's a very difficult question to answer, unfortunately. It could end tomorrow, frankly, if Russia decided to withdraw from Ukraine. But frankly, from the very beginning of this war, Ukrainians have shown that they are willing to pay a huge price and sacrifice to maintain the borders and the independence of their country. Unfortunately, they're facing a leader, a dictator, Putin, who is willing to inflict both huge harm to both Ukraine, but also to Russia itself. We've seen huge losses from, Russia. We've seen well over 100,000 military dead, and of course, huge economic cost for Russia because of the war. And I think the fact that, Russia continues to attack Ukraine despite these huge costs really shows the determination from Putin that he is not willing to be sidetracked in terms of what he is trying to achieve. But I think also, in terms of the longevity of the war, one of the main problems is that Putin's sort of survival is now dependent on the outcome of the war. And if you have a sort of major defeat for Putin, major military losses, major economic losses, and really he's not able to present that in a way that shows some kind of Russian victory or the Russians got something out of that, then he knows that he will face major domestic consequences for that, which he is not willing to face. So unfortunately, we are faced in a very difficult position where, Ukrainians, of course, understandably are completely unwilling to compromise their independence and their democracy and their freedom. And on the other side, we have a dictator who is ultimately prioritizing his own survival above the long-term peaceful interests of the continent.
Thank you, Mr. Schwartz, for joining us on WION this hour and sharing your insights on this. Thanks very much.
Good to be with you.